Colonel MacGregor, I know we don't directly have U.S. military boots on the ground yet, and Ukraine is essentially leaning heavily on U.S. military intel. But is Zelensky a good wartime leader? Meaning, does he have good generals and colonels around him, or is he just a former sitcom actor relying heavily on the United States and NATO?
Well, I think the last point is accurate, but he was recruited by this oligarch, Kolomoisky, who is also the man that has funded these neo-Nazi units that have been guilty of terrible crimes against captured Russian troops and civilians, and are still committing crimes every day in Ukraine, threatening and murdering people that do not or will not support Zelensky and his regime. Zelensky himself was picked because he was an actor, and he's done a brilliant job of acting. Is there any depth of understanding? Of course not. Now, whether or not his officers are any good, that's very much open to dispute. After all, most of these people, when they were finally selected, they spent a lot of time being trained and educated by us. You know, one of the things that worried me from the very beginning was this light infantry-centric mentality in the U.S. and British armies. And the reason I worried about it was that I was afraid that tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers would be lost in urban areas, because the Russians aren't fools. In most cases, they're not going to bother digging people out of these areas. They'll simply lay siege to them, which is exactly what happened in a place like Mariupol. And thousands of good Ukrainian troops were lost because they were simply captured ultimately, or slowly ground into bits. But I think there was a lot of bad thinking and bad tactical advice. And under the circumstances, I think the Ukrainians did the best job that they could. But the point is, I don't think we can really evaluate it in great detail, because it's always a mix. You're always going to have some people at the top who are good and some who are not. And right now, the people that are retained and being trusted by Zelensky are the yes men, the people who unconditionally do whatever he tells them to do. And remember, he's got this neo-Nazi force inside the country, ensuring that people obey his orders. Now, as far as the manpower goes, the NATO military manpower has increased dramatically. We have good sources that suggest there are at least 20,000 Polish soldiers in Ukrainian uniform. And the Russians listen to Polish spoken on the radios and in combat all the time. You have to add to those some unknown number of mercenaries, many of whom are former U.S. soldiers. And then you have people that are there as quote unquote contractors. You know, this is an Austrian colonel pointed out in an interview quite recently. I think his name is Liesner, something like that. He said, if I take my uniform off tomorrow and I put on the Ukrainian uniform, then I'm no longer a member of NATO and serving in the Austrian army. I'm fighting for Ukraine. Well, good luck with that, because if he's captured by the Russians, they can execute him. He has no protection under the Geneva Convention. None of these foreigners in Ukrainian uniform or nondescript uniform will be safe. Then we have lots of people on the ground that are operating, as you point out, as extensions of our intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance community. The Ukrainians have the benefit of some of the best information and intelligence in the world that we transmit immediately. The problem for the Ukrainians is they can't always act on it.
Okay, thank you for that. I don't know how much you know about this, but it's been coming out more and more that Zelensky is having to cut ties with people high up in the Ukrainian government because of corruption and stealing money. I read recently that around $100 billion from United States taxpayer money has been put up for this war, and they believe anywhere from 30 to 50% of that money is just being eaten up in money laundering and Ukrainian corruption. I also read that only about 1/3 of U.S. military weaponry that's being sent over is ending up on the front lines. The rest is being taken, sold on the black market, or even ending up in the hands of the Russian, soldiers that are fighting. Have you heard any of this? What do you know about this?
Well, I know that the Caesar artillery system that France provided to the Ukrainians that at least one of those systems, and I've forgotten how many they provided, I think somewhere in the neighborhood of 18 or 20. These are large gun systems, very accurate, rapid fire, that at least one of them was directly sold to the Russians on the battlefield by Ukrainians. So there's clearly truth in what you're saying, but when we start talking about percentages, we don't know. We all know that Zelensky and his inner circle have fat bank accounts in Cyprus. We know that Zelensky and his friends own property in the West. I'm sure that when this is over, long before anybody gets to Zelensky, either the Ukrainians that want to kill him or the Russians that want to kill him, he'll probably escape to the West. He may well end up in the United States or somewhere else in elaborate surroundings. I mean, this has happened before. You know, Karzai's brother from Afghanistan has a 23-room bathroom mansion in Maryland somewhere. How does this happen? Well, it happens because of the widespread corruption and pilfering of dollars. You know, when you turn on the faucet and you just pour money into any place, you're going to corrupt the place. And that's what we've done in virtually everywhere we've gone. We deform the economy and we corrupt it. Not intentionally. It's an unavoidable outcome.
Okay. Yeah. I remember reading the former president of Afghanistan left with like a carload full of American money and was able to escape with his life, right? Let's switch gears for 1 minute.
Well, before we leave that, just to point out that you could see members of the Ukrainian cabinet, the Zelensky government, traveling back and forth between Kiev and the Polish border in their Porsches and their Mercedes and BMWs.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, no. I appreciate the insight. This is why I have you on. Just real quickly on Afghanistan. The US media has essentially done a blackout on the United States pulling out of Afghanistan. I remember seeing the picture of President Biden looking very frail, by himself, not surrounded by his board. Is there ever going to be any accountability for the way that we withdrew from Afghanistan, or has the media moved on in order to cover for a sitting president?
All of the above. There are lots of people on both sides of the aisle that profited from Afghanistan, just as they are profiting from the debacle in Ukraine. There is very little interest on the Hill in pressing this issue of accountability, because if you live in a glass house, throwing stones is dangerous. So I don't expect much accountability to come about as a result of anything Congress undertakes. There are very few people up there, in my judgment, that Americans would genuinely approve of if they knew anything about them. I wish people would pay more attention to where the money goes in Washington, D.C., because that explains many of our policies that most Americans on any given day would not support. So I think we need to understand something, that when President Trump took office in the summer of 2017, he wanted to get out of Afghanistan. When he announced that and insisted, that's what I want out, he was stonewalled by virtually everybody in his administration, with the exception of Steve Bannon and the man who became the Attorney General, Jeffries. I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank.
It's okay.
But Bannon was a stalwart for Trump and said, yes, we got to get out. All of the retired generals, acting generals, most of his staff said, oh, no, you can't just leave. If you leave, everything will fall apart. Well, it didn't matter when we left, Steve. We could have left 15 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago. Didn't matter. It was always going to fall apart. You know, what people in that part of the world don't build for themselves does not survive the departure of foreign military power. We went into Iraq and Afghanistan, these places, essentially said, you can all go home now. We're in charge. We'll tell you who we want in charge and how to do it. And we're going to rebuild everything and turn you into this gleaming city on a hill, a liberal democracy like the West. Well, this is all nonsense. It never had any chance of success. You created the corruption problem. So Donald Trump understood that. He wanted out. He didn't know how to get out. And he took time. He refused to fire people. You know, thank you, General, for your interest in national defense. we're getting out of Afghanistan, you're fired. Didn't do it. He let this drag on and drag on and drag on. Finally, towards the end of his administration, he's frustrated. He recognizes that many of the things he wanted to achieve, he hadn't. He'd been subverted left and right by everybody inside his own administration. I and others who had not previously held any positions were brought in, and he made it very clear that he wanted to get out of Afghanistan. And that's how I was brought into the equation. I was handed a note from the president, and I knew from my discussions with the president, he wanted out, no question about it. I knew from my discussions in the building and with everybody in uniform that spent any time in Afghanistan that the time to leave was midwinter. That was the best time to go, because most of your opponents, your potential adversaries, were sitting next to a heater, a stove, or a fire somewhere in the mountains. People were not going to come out and fight with you at that time of year. It wasn't part of what they call the fighting season. And we knew it wouldn't be easy, but we knew it could be done. And so he said, write an order and I'll sign it. I wrote an order. Subsequently, the order was changed. It was massaged and so forth. He writes it. And of course, immediately everyone is up in arms. Oh, you can't do this. If you do this, the world will end. We can't possibly just leave. And so what did we do? We waited until the summer, the worst time of year to leave, when the enemy is plentiful, in abundance, and ready to halt and interfere with you. We tried to negotiate a deal with them. And instead of systematically removing billions of dollars of useful equipment, or at least if we couldn't remove it all, destroying what remained, you see what happened. We just walked out. We abandoned everything. The same generals who were there under Trump, who subverted him, were still there under President Biden. And what did they do? They did a terrible job. This is this man, McKenzie, who was in CENTCOM, Milley, who was the chairman. Look at all the individuals that were involved in this sort of thing, and it was a catastrophe because everyone wanted to stay forever. Politicians find comfort in the presence of U.S. forces, even if the U.S. forces are failing, even if they're taking casualties, as long as they are not held responsible for the debacle. So what happens is that we stayed, and we stayed, and we stayed. And there were lots of four-star generals ready to step forward and say, well, we are making progress. We have done well here and here and here. When in reality, we know we weren't making any progress. It was chipping away at the Rock of Gibraltar. We should have gotten out of there 20 years ago. We didn't need to be in that country for more than 6 months. But again, you got all the way back, and remember, we didn't get Osama bin Laden and his little band. So the first person that made the first gargantuan error that failed in that mission, and remember, you're talking about the United States military surveillance state, the National Security Agency, the CIA, the Special Operations Command, places where we invest hundreds of billions of dollars, and we can't even bring to justice one man and a group of perhaps 300 or 400 stalwart supporters. This is back in 1997, or excuse me, not 97, back in 2001 and 2002. Did we hold General Franks responsible for that failure? He was given the mission. It was his task. Did we do anything to him? No. And so you have this cascading effect, a series of general officers who come in. Some do well, some don't. There is no accountability. No one has stood up and said, you failed, you're out. And again, the politicians don't want to do that. They're all very reluctant to do anything because almost none of them have spent any time in uniform. And virtually none of them have ever been in action or seen any real action. So they all feel uncomfortable. We used to have this problem with the so-called Vietnam draft dodgers like Mr. Biden. Now we have it with all of these people who've never really served and done anything. Oh, I don't think I'm comfortable doing that to the general. And they look at these officers that have vast medals on their chests. They don't realize none of them mean a damn thing. They're all thank you for coming medals. It's rare that you see anything for valor under fire. And those are the only things that count. What a soldier does under fire is what's meaningful. Everything else is nonsense, frankly speaking, because everything else is designed to prepare him to fight. So, make a long story short, no, there's not going to be any accountability in the near term. And I think we're going to continue to act like, well, I'm sorry, that's the way it goes. We did the best we could. And so we lost $80 billion. And so we funded the Islamist terrorists for several more years. And to go back to your original question, yes, American weapons are being resold in Kosovo, which is another gleaming pearl of success. And they're finding their way into Iraq and into Syria and into North Africa and down into Central Africa. Of course. Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. One comment and then our final question. I appreciate your time.
Sure.
Do members of DC politics, there's something called stolen valor, where people dress up and pretend to be veterans or active duty people in order to get money. I think it's disgusting. Do you think, it seems like, just based on what you said, some of these politicians are exercising stolen valor, where they take comfort in knowing that they've got men and women in uniform guarding a post and that they're the money person making sure that you're taken care of. And yet then they hide behind that military power and that military presence. To me, this almost seems like stolen valor, where they're putting up the money, but it's not even their money. And yet they take pride in the US military, but they don't stand a post.
Well, I think that's true. There's no question about it. We have to understand that our government is the best government money can buy. I mean, I listen to people say, oh, China's the new threat. We have to defeat China. Well, first of all, China is not, in military terms, threatening us at all. It's not attacking us, never has. Well, why are we suddenly concerned about China if China really is not militarily engaged in direct action against us, nor will it, in my judgment? Well, follow the money. As Russia winds down, it becomes clear we're not going to win anything in Ukraine. How do you continue to line your pockets if you can't continue to spend money on defense? I mean, defense is one of these things where if you're not careful, someone will wake up and decide, well, you know, the real threats to this country are in the Western Hemisphere. They come from the Caribbean Basin and Mexico. Well, nobody's terribly excited about that because that doesn't justify massive expenditures on the scale of the current defense budget. It's very inexpensive to close your border. It's inexpensive to get control of immigration, much less expensive to go into cities and restore the rule of law. But no one's really interested in doing that. So we let the country bleed and hemorrhage, while at the same time we're pouring money into this place called Ukraine, which is a corrupt black hole. Well, that's because people are profiting from it. And you can see the homes and where they live and how they're enjoying life as a result. Americans need to wake up. That's what I really got to say. Americans have been too complacent, Steve, for too long. They have to understand that no one is coming to save them. If you don't like where the economy is headed, if you don't like the things we're doing, then it's time for you to get involved. And your anger has to be translated into some sort of action that compels performance. I haven't seen that yet. And until we see that, nothing will change.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. Final question, then I'll let you go. Is Washington, D.C. ever going to seek peace and arrange an opportunity to sit down with Putin? Or is the game plan to just throw money at this until Ukraine decides what is peace? And does Ukraine even have an opportunity of winning at this point?
No, Ukraine never did. It's just that Russia did not treat Ukraine as a serious opponent. And I don't think Mr. Putin ever thought in his wildest dreams that we would do what we have done in that country to keep this war going. So the answer is Ukraine is probably the last to know and has almost no impact whatsoever on this. Remember, they're down to 18 to 22 million people from a population that a year ago was 37.4 million. This is a government that's a runaway train called the Zelensky regime, doing all sorts of things that no one in this country would approve of under normal circumstances. So no, I don't think that has much to do with it. I think, again, we'll do what we did after Vietnam. Well, we pushed the remaining equipment that we didn't think was worth anything into the South China Sea, and we sailed away. And nobody talked about it much anymore. We killed 2 million Vietnamese. We lost 58,000 dead. Well, the Ukrainians have already lost much more than in the last year than we ever lost in Vietnam. But what happened to the 2 million Vietnamese dead? Well, we didn't admit to it until many, many decades later, In fact, I think we said, oh, maybe we killed a couple of 100,000. We
Okay.
just walk away. Remember, we are primarily an aerospace or maritime power. We are not a land power anywhere except in our own hemisphere. So we always have the opportunity when things don't go our way to get on board the aircraft or get on board ship and leave. And the American people have proven repeatedly they have very short memories. And you change the subject and you tell the media to stop talking about it. And if the media doesn't talk about it, well, you go back home to your Barca lounge, you open your can of beer and you watch cable TV. That's what they depend on, the people in Washington. That's what they bet on, that no one will pay any attention. This time, I think it's going to be different because I think Russia is not Serbia. Russia is not Iraq. We are not going to defeat Russia. Russia will have its way in Ukraine. Russia will annihilate the Ukrainian armed forces. This regime will not survive. And as a result, NATO won't survive. NATO will crumble because people in Europe will finally recognize what we've been doing. Waging war overseas at great expense to them and at the expense of their national interests, at the expense of their security, and that Mr. Putin is not Dr. Evil and has no interest in waging war against the rest of Europe. On the contrary, he wants to do business with them. And the Chinese want to get across Central Asia because you want your rail lines to link you in China to railheads in Europe so goods and services can be moved back and forth. You got to have peace and stability for that. Russia has been providing the peace and stability by bolstering people in Central Asia, keeping that place running effectively so the Chinese can build this one belt, one road. We don't want that to succeed. The way to stop this successful trade route is to do what? Create instability and war. The Chinese lose in our estimation and the Russians lose, but in the long run, no. Central Asia is going to be stable. In the long run, those lines are going to open. That trade will occur. We're fighting the inevitable pointlessly, when instead we should be looking at ways to capitalize on it ourselves, to work with the rest of the world. We are seen as people who are completely selfish, completely self-interested, no sympathy for or interested in anybody other than ourselves. That's a very bad reputation to have. Remarkably different from the way the world viewed us 50 years ago.
Yeah. Well, and from what we've discussed today, Germany may be the first one to wake up and say, we can't be, funding all of your wars, and we need Putin for that energy. And that may be the turning point, because as you mentioned, Berlin, 50,000 people protesting, end this war, end this war. They may be the first one to get it to go their way.
Well, we'll see. I think something is going to happen that will change conditions over there. The Europeans are the ones that are going to have to stand up and say, thank you, but no thank you. But we got to stop this obsession with this man, Putin. We're dealing with the Russian people and the Russian state. We act as though he's the single link in the great chain of evil. That's a lot of nonsense. There's no chain of evil. You can't threaten an entire nation of people with destruction and expect them to sit down with you and talk to you. I don't think Putin will talk to anybody in Washington right now. He won't talk to anybody here until this administration is gone. And I think his view of Western Europe is very similar. You've all lied to me. You haven't told us the truth. The Minsk Accords were a facade, a joke. So don't expect us to sit down and have tea with you and entertain any thoughts or ideas you may have. He'll wait until there's new leadership in Europe. And that's coming.
Okay. Yeah. I'll let you go here, but Judge Andrew Napolitano mentioned to me that it seems like there is bad blood between Putin and Joe Biden, and that may be driving more of this than we know, but maybe that's for a different discussion.
No, we got to get out of this petty personality nonsense. It's all about interests, strategic interests. It's not, do I like Miss So-and-so who is prime minister or Mr. So-and-so who is the current chancellor of Germany. It has nothing to do with that. What are Germany's interests? What are Russia's interests? What are our interests? We tend to define our interests in any way we like because we don't live in Europe.
Yeah.
We don't live in Asia. So we just make our minds, oh, well, this week, this is important to us. Next week, that may not be important anymore. But for the people that live in Europe and Asia, that live with China and Russia, that's unacceptable. Their interests are relatively permanent. If you sit in Berlin today and you look east, your views are not terribly dissimilar from the views that were held 100 or 200 years ago. You're interested in the same kind of terms of trade that will boost prosperity and maintain stability. The good thing, what has really changed, is Europeans and most people in Asia are completely disinterested in going to war. They've had enough. We're the ones that keep talking about war, war, war. Yet we do nothing to protect our borders. We do nothing to protect our country. We leave our intellectual property on the table to be stolen. We ship our industries overseas. China did not rob us of our manufacturing base. We robbed ourselves of it. Greedy people in Washington and the corporate sector ship those things out. This is what people have to get through their heads. Stop looking overseas for someone to blame for the misery that we confront today at home. We are the authors of our own mess, and those authors are principally in Washington and in the corporate sector. Americans need to wake up. That's the problem. It's not in Beijing. It's not in Moscow. It's here.